The time has come, yet again, to discuss another contentious and controversial project on America's public lands.
On the Ambler Road project, specifically the record of decision.
I have done explainer videos like this before with Bears Ears and the Willow project, but for this video, we're going to take a look at the Ambler Mining Road. With both Bears Ears and the Willow project though, both of those were pretty much already done when I talked about them, or at least the approvals and key decisions had already been made. As a result, those explainers were kind of retroactive, helping you understand projects that had already been approved, but which, upon watching them, you couldn't really have much of a say in. This video is going to be different. In this video, I'm going to give you all the information you need to make an informed decision about the Ambler Road, which is similar to what I've done with other videos like this, but this time around, you'll be able to use that information to let your voice be heard. Because the Ambler Mining Road has yet to receive its final approvals, and the Bureau of Land Management is accepting public comment on its new analysis of the road through December 22nd. The feedback they receive during this process will ultimately factor into the final decision to approve or deny the permit for the Ambler Mining Road. And if you've watched this channel for long enough, but especially if you've seen my other explainers covering topics like this, you'll know that I highly value this sort of critical analysis and informed debate when it comes to making decisions about public lands issues in the United States. So again, that's what we're doing here. This video will have everything you need to know about the Ambler Mining Road, including what and where it is, why it's being proposed, a timeline of the road up to this point, the impacts it's expected to have, and the arguments both in favor and in opposition to the project moving forward. At the end of the video, I will give you my own personal opinion on how I feel about the Ambler Mining Road. Okay, let's get started. Let's first orient ourselves geographically. The Ambler Mining Road, officially known as the Ambler Mining District Industrial Access Project, would be located in Alaska. As proposed, it would stretch 211 miles from mile marker 161 on the Dalton Highway, just south of Coldfoot, and extend west across the southern reaches of the Brooks Mountain Range to the southern bank of the Ambler River. From here, the road would be used to access minerals like copper, zinc, cobalt, and others in an area known as the Ambler Mining District. As of yet, there are no mines currently here, but that's kind of the point of the road, to make the area accessible for mining. In addition, as proposed, the Ambler Road would not be publicly accessible. Access would only be granted to vehicles involved in the mining operations. Ambler would be an industrial access corridor, not a public road. Now, this alignment, the one we just spoke about, is one of only 4 possible options, or alternatives as the BLM refers to them, for the Ambler Road. Meaning, as part of their analysis, the BLM has selected 4 different possibilities for routes the Ambler Road could take. The 211-mile one we just talked about is known as Alternative A. Additionally, there's Alternative B, which is a 228-mile alignment that has the same start and end point as Alternative A, but has a little dip in it to avoid the amount of road that crosses through Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. We'll talk more about the park in a bit. Alternative C is a 332-mile alignment, which starts way further south on the Dalton Highway around mile marker 60, and it cuts northwest and avoids Gates of the Arctic altogether, before ultimately ending up in the same place as both Alternatives A and B. Finally, there is a no-action alternative that the BLM could choose, which is a technical term that just means that the road wouldn't be built at all. If that alternative is chosen, the permit would not be issued, and the Ambler Road would not be built. Obviously, each of these options would have specific, localized impacts along the given route from road construction and operation. But these impacts are really a matter of degree, and in general, the impacts of the Ambler Road, no matter which route is chosen, are the same. So, for the purposes of this video, when I refer to the Ambler Road and its impacts, I'm talking about Alternative A, the 211-mile route. This is the route favored by the applicant and is the one you're most likely to hear about when the Ambler Road is discussed. If you'd like to see the list of detailed localized impacts for each alternative, there's a link to the full BLM analysis in the description. All right, and since we're already talking about the applicant, let's just go ahead and discuss who is proposing to build the Ambler Road in the first place. Because honestly, that's one of the keys to understanding this whole project. Officially, the applicant is the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority, or IDEA, which is a public corporation run by the state of Alaska. They are proposing to build the road and maintain it at a cost of roughly $1.4 billion for a 50-year right-of-way. Honestly, the intricacies of how this organization works are pretty complicated and way beyond the scope of this video, but basically what IDEA does is facilitate industrial development projects that are supposed to benefit the Alaskan economy and the Alaskan people. You can argue in the comments whether or not you think they've actually achieved this, but in theory, this is why they were created by the Alaskan legislature, to provide funding and institutional support for industrial and economic development projects. In the case of Ambler specifically, they are proposing to finance the construction and maintenance of the road in order to provide access to the Ambler Mining District, with the theory being that once the area is more accessible, private companies like Ambler Metals LLC, who is also involved in this, can then move in and develop those resources, i.e. mine them, thus providing jobs and economic opportunities for local Alaskans. Now, the tricky thing about the Ambler Road, and really the only reason we're having this discussion at all right now, is that it crosses lands owned and managed by all these different groups, which means the project needs approvals from all of those groups. 61% of the lands the road would cross are indeed already owned by the state of Alaska. So that's not really a big deal for IDEA in terms of approvals because, again, they're basically already an arm of the state government. Not many approvals needed. 15% of the lands to be crossed are owned by various private native corporations, in this case the Doyon Corporation and the Nana Corporation. They also have their own approvals and permissions process. In fact, the Doyon Corporation, which had previously granted access to these lands for exploration and testing, recently revoked that access. They're not happy with how they've been treated by IDEA, so we'll have to see how this plays out in the future. Finally, though, the last remaining portions of land that the Ambler Road would cross are owned by the federal government, about 24% of the total mileage. 26 of these miles cross through gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. The federal government has the most complicated and rigorous approval process, which is, again, why we're having this conversation right now. The public comment period, the BLM analysis I've been referring to this entire time, that is all part of the federal approval process. At this point, the feds are basically the final arbiters of whether or not this project moves forward. They've got the last word. And in order to understand the entire federal approval process, it's best we now take a look back at the timeline for this project, how we got to this point in November 2023. You all know I love a good history lesson, and diving into the history of this project is going to help us contextualize the entire thing a whole lot better. So let's start in 1980. This is the year the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA, was passed. ANILCA is, again, one of those things that's very complicated, and explaining it fully is, again, not really within the scope of this video. It really honestly deserves its own video, and I will cover it at some point. But for now, what you need to know is that ANILCA was the law that created a whole bunch of national parks in Alaska, including Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. However, ANILCA contained a provision that states, quote, "There is a need for access for surface transportation purposes across the western Kobuk River unit of the Gates of the Arctic National Preserve, from the Ambler Mining District to the Alaska Pipeline Haul Road, and the Secretary shall permit such access in accordance with the provisions of this subsection." What that little provision means is that when Congress created Gates of the Arctic National Preserve as part of ANILCA, they also basically made it a requirement that the Ambler Road would be allowed to pass through it. However, they also mandated that the National Park Service conduct what they called an environmental and economic analysis to look at how a potential road would impact the preserve's fish and wildlife, as well as the traditional subsistence activities for those native tribes in the road's path. This EEA, as it is known, would replace an environmental impact statement, or EIS, which is a more rigorous form of environmental analysis mandated by the National Environmental Policy Act. An EIS would have typically been required for a project like this, but again, ANILCA specifically exempts the Ambler Road and requires an EEA instead. However, an EIS would still be required for this project, because the road also passes through federal land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, who is not exempted from an EIS by ANILCA. And again, an EIS is a more in-depth analysis. It's more rigorous and more likely to fully reveal the impact of a project. I know, it's all very bureaucratic and confusing, but this is the stage that was set when Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve was created. The Park Service was required to complete the less rigorous environmental and economic assessment, while the Bureau of Land Management would have to continue on with a more detailed, more rigorous environmental impact statement in the event that the Ambler Road permit was applied for, which is exactly what happened. In 2015, IDEA applies for their permit, thus kicking off the required approvals and analyses. In 2020, that process came to a close, and the Ambler Mining Road was actually approved at that time by the Trump administration. Right-of-way permits were issued. But later that same year, litigation was brought by the National Parks Conservation Association, as well as the native nonprofit organization, the Tanana Chiefs Conference, in opposition to those approvals. In 2022, the Biden administration voluntarily requested to essentially redo the BLM environmental impact statement because they found quote-unquote significant deficiencies in the original analysis. The right-of-way permits were suspended at this time pending the results of the new EIS. And that is where we find ourselves today. Back in October of this year, 2023, the BLM released the results of its new analysis. That is the analysis now up for public comment, and which I have been referring to this entire video, and which will ultimately be used to inform the final decision on whether or not to approve the Ambler Mining Road. All right, so that should bring us fully up to speed with the project up to this point. What it is, where it is, why it's being proposed, who is involved, and how it gets its approvals. I apologize here for really getting in the weeds. A lot of the stuff I just talked about, like ANILCA and NEPA, they really just deserve their own video, honestly, and trying to condense it down here can really make your head spin if you're not familiar with them. I get it, but I think the full context is really important to understanding this project and ultimately helping you come to an informed decision about it. Feel free to re-watch any section of the video, or if you want to, just leave a comment down below with any questions you may have, and I'll do my best to answer them. But now, I want to discuss the impacts of the Ambler Road. What is going to happen to the landscape if this thing is built? If built, the Ambler Road would cross roughly 26 miles of the preserve section of Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. This area is one of the last remaining undisturbed large tracts of land in the United States, encompassing some 16 million contiguous national park acres, as well as nearly 13 million acres of contiguous federally designated wilderness. It would also cross more than 3,000 streams and rivers, including the Kobuk National Scenic River. This means that thousands of culverts would be needed to channel those streams and rivers under the roadbed, in addition to numerous bridges. According to the BLM, this would, quote, affect natural flow patterns, erosion patterns, natural channel migration, ponding, and flooding patterns, end quote, as well as, quote, hasten thawing of permafrost in localized areas, and could damage natural topography and alter water flows and vegetation patterns, end quote. Construction would also lead to wetlands being filled in and vegetation destroyed along the entire length of the road corridor. In terms of wildlife impacts, there are two main concerns. One has to do with the fish native to this area, including several species of salmon and anadromous fish, as well as the she fish. These fish stand to have their habitat and spawning areas degraded as a result of the water quality impacts we just talked about. She fish also have relatively few known spawning locations in this area of Alaska, but 2 of them are within the project area, and the overall reduction in water quality due to sedimentation and channel alterations threatens not only these locations, but those of the other fish species as well. The other concern here is for caribou. The danger is particularly acute for them considering the Western Arctic herd is already in sharp decline. The herd contains over 100,000 animals who travel over 2,000 miles each year as part of the longest land migration in North America. Their population has declined by nearly a third since the early 2000s. All alignments of the road would disturb more than 4,000 acres of caribou habitat and is projected to disturb migration patterns by fragmenting already sensitive areas. In addition, these animals are key subsistence resources for many Alaska Native communities that would be impacted by the construction of the Ambler Road. In fact, one of the quote-unquote significant deficiencies that caused the BLM analysis to even be redone in the first place was that the original study did not adequately address the impacts to subsistence lifestyles of Alaska Natives in this area. The new study states that, quote, impacts to subsistence and public health, including stress, subsistence food insecurity, and potential exposure to toxins from road and mine operations would disproportionately affect low-income and minority populations, specifically Alaska Native villages in and near the project area that depend on the surrounding area for their subsistence lifestyle, end quote. It goes on to say that, quote, the BLM has found in its subsistence evaluation that alternatives A, B, C, and the cumulative case considered in this draft supplemental EIS may significantly restrict subsistence uses in multiple communities, end quote. There are also expected to be impacts to recreation resources, as these lands are used for ecotourism, hunting, and fishing. The mines that this road would provide access to would also have associated environmental impacts. However, these mines have not been built nor even applied for, so the full impact cannot yet be analyzed. The mines are expected to be open pit, however, and each would require their own set of approvals and environmental analyses. So, those are the big impacts: a severe degradation of water quality, threats and losses to fish habitat and spawning areas, as well as important caribou habitat and migration corridors, significant impacts to Alaska Native subsistence lifestyles, and impacts to recreational resources, as well as environmental impacts for the anticipated mines. If you'd like to read the full list of impacts with more detailed descriptions, again, the study is linked in the description. Now, at this point, as I like to do with these explainers, I want to talk about the arguments both in favor of and in opposition to the construction of the Ambler Road. The reason I include this section is because it forces you to think about your own values and positions and how closely they align with the different arguments surrounding issues like Ambler. So, like with the Willow Project, the entire Alaskan congressional delegation, which is bipartisan, is in favor of the Ambler Mining Road, along with Alaska's governor. Also in favor are the mining companies and extractive industries. They stand to benefit financially from its approval, so no real surprise there. It is also important to note that there are Alaska Natives in support of the Ambler Road, mainly for economic reasons and job opportunities. Arguments in favor of the road cite the abundance of critical minerals in the Ambler Mining District as necessary for the clean energy transition. Metals like copper, cobalt, zinc, and others are critical components of clean energy infrastructure like solar panels and wind turbines. And proponents argue that having a domestic supply of these minerals both prepares the United States for that transition, as well as reduces our dependence on foreign sources for these minerals. They claim that the minerals can be extracted in environmentally responsible ways. Proponents also cite the economic benefits that mining and construction jobs would provide to locals in the area, including Alaska Natives. On the other hand, opponents of the Ambler Road argue that you can't save the environment by destroying it, and that the benefits these minerals could provide in terms of clean energy don't outweigh the destruction of a pristine Alaskan wilderness. They claim that clean energy materials can be found in more accessible, less environmentally sensitive areas, and would have less impact on fish, wildlife, and native subsistence communities. They also claim that it's not clear how much material is even available to be mined in the area, and that the uncertainty is, again, not worth the destruction of a fragile Alaskan landscape. Native communities are concerned about the impacts to their subsistence lifestyles and culture, seeing the road as a threat to their way of life. The groups leading this opposition include many environmental and conservation organizations, as well as Native communities and organizations. So, that is the Ambler Mining Road. Everything you need to know about how this project came about, what it is, what impacts it will have, and who is for it and who is against it. Now is the portion of the video where I share my opinion on the Ambler Road. Like with the Willow project, I don't think it will come as any surprise that I am opposed to the Ambler Road project. I can see the arguments in favor of it, acknowledge them and respect them, but at the end of the day, my values and beliefs will always align with the preservation of special places. I mean, I've dedicated this entire channel to those values and those beliefs and those places. And it is anathema to me that we would destroy one of Earth's last great wildernesses to build a private mining road that threatens fish, wildlife, and native communities. I also wonder, when will it end? We seem to always talk about these projects individually, analyzing each one's impacts in isolation, as if these places are not part of larger interconnected landscapes, ecosystems, and cultures. The Ambler Road is not the first project of its kind, and it won't be the last. These types of places are under threat all over the world. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Some impacts here, some there, until finally we're left with nothing. No more wild places. At some point, I think enough is enough. At some point, wild places need to remain wild. And those are my thoughts. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I know this episode was pretty dense, a lot to talk about, a lot of moving parts, a lot of information to cover, so I appreciate you sticking around to the end. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that the public comment period that is open right now is open through December 22nd. I've left a link in the description to that public comment page so you can go and make your voice heard. There's also a link to the National Parks Conservation Association's automated opposition letter. It's really easy. All you have to do is fill out some of your personal info and they'll send an opposition letter in your name. I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't think it wasn't important for people to know about this issue. So please, please, please do go voice your opinion. If you like what you've seen in this video and you want to learn more about parks, protected areas, and public lands projects like this one, do be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the little bell thing. All of those help the channel out tremendously and help me reach more people with these stories. And if you're feeling extra generous this holiday season, I do have a Patreon as well. Support on Patreon really helps me keep the lights on this channel. Ad revenue can fluctuate pretty wildly, and Patreon provides a nice, stable form of income so that I can continue to make these videos the best that I possibly can. It quite literally is the single biggest thing you can do to support the channel, if you're able, of course. You can head over to patreon.com/nationalparkdiaries to learn more. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.